My name is Clara Jensen. I still remember the first time I met Ethan Morales. It was on a cold winter morning in Brookhaven, a small town far from the busy cities. I was standing near the bus station, waiting for my ride to work, when I saw him pushing a small wooden cart. His head was bent low against the wind, and his hands were red from the cold. At first, I thought he was just another young man trying to make a little money. But as time passed, I learned his story. And once you know his story, you cannot forget it. Ethan was 24 when I met him. He lived with his mother, Rosa, in a one-room house at the edge of town. The roof leaked when it rained, the walls were cracked, and the air inside was always cold in winter. There was no proper kitchen, only a small table and 2 chairs. They shared a thin mattress on the floor. Rosa had been raising Ethan alone since his father died in a construction accident when Ethan was only 8 years old. After that, life became hard. Rosa cleaned houses for rich families in the town and sometimes worked in their gardens. She left home before sunrise and came back after dark. Her hands were rough. Her back hurt, but she never complained. She often smiled at Ethan and told him, "One day, you will have a better life. I know you will." Ethan loved his mother more than anything in the world. He had stopped school after finishing 10th grade because they could not afford the fees. Instead, he worked wherever he could. He cleaned floors in small shops, carried heavy boxes in the market, and washed cars in parking lots. Every coin he earned went to his mother. He wore old clothes and ate simple meals, but he never wished for more. All he wanted was to give Rosa a warm house, new clothes, and a life without pain. Still, life was not kind. People often laughed at Ethan because of his worn-out shoes and faded shirts. Some said, "You will always be poor. Nothing will change." Ethan never argued. He just kept working. He believed that hard work was the only way forward. Yet deep inside, he dreamed. Sometimes, after a long day, he would walk past the rich part of town. He would see bright lights shining from big houses. He would see families sitting at tables full of food and children playing in gardens. He didn't feel jealous. Instead, he imagined Rosa living in one of those houses, sitting in a soft chair, smiling without worry. One evening, while Ethan was walking home from work, he met an old school friend named Tommy Reed. They hadn't spoken in years, but they sat on a bench and talked. Tommy worked in a garage and knew how hard life could be. After listening to Ethan, Tommy said, "Why don't you start something of your own? Even something small. You could sell coffee and pastries near the bus station. You're smart, Ethan. People would come." That night, Ethan could not sleep. The idea stayed in his mind. Could he really start his own business? He took out an old metal tin box hidden under his bed. Inside was his savings from 5 years of hard work, coins, small bills, and a few tips he had kept aside. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a start. The next week, he bought a small second-hand cart. It was old and scratched, but it was his. He cleaned it carefully, painted it light blue, and fixed a small sign on the front. Rosa's Coffee and Pastries. Ethan chose a spot near the Brookhaven bus station. Every morning, hundreds of people passed by on their way to work. On his first day, he stood behind the cart from sunrise to late afternoon, ready to serve. But most people walked past without stopping. He kept smiling, offering greetings, and hoping. By the third day, a young woman bought a cup of coffee and told him it was good. She came back the next morning and brought a friend. Slowly, word began to spread. People liked his warm smile, the clean cart, and the way he remembered their names. He offered free sugar refills and extra napkins, and he always thanked his customers. Within a month, Ethan earned enough to buy Rosa a second-hand armchair so she could rest her back in the evenings. The next month, he surprised her with a small heater for the cold nights. Rosa's eyes filled with tears when she saw it. She touched his face and said, "You are already rich in my eyes, Ethan." He didn't say much, but inside, his heart made a promise to keep going. The seasons changed, and his little business grew. Some mornings were hard. Rain soaked his clothes. Winter froze his hands. But Ethan didn't stop. He believed that every cup of coffee brought him closer to his dream. People began to know him as the young man with the blue cart and the kind smile. Some came for the drinks, others just for a short, friendly chat. One bright spring morning, something happened that would change his life. As I waited for my bus, I saw a woman approach his cart. She wore a pale green dress, and her hair was tied back loosely. She looked tired but smiled politely as she ordered. Ethan poured her coffee and said, "You look like you could use a warm morning." She laughed softly. "Yes, it's been a long day already." She sat on a nearby bench, and during his break, Ethan joined her. That was the first time he met Sophie Allen. Sophie worked in a small office nearby. She started visiting his cart almost every day. They talked about simple things, her work, the weather, their favorite foods. Weeks passed, and their conversations grew longer. Ethan began to wake up earlier to make sure her favorite pastry was ready when she arrived. Though he never said the words, he was falling in love. After a month, Ethan invited Sophie to meet Rosa. He cleaned the house as best as he could, fixed the leaky roof with old wood, and bought biscuits for tea. Rosa wore her nicest dress and waited with a hopeful smile. Sophie arrived on time, but her eyes moved around the small room. She saw the cracked walls and old furniture. She smiled politely but spoke little. When she left, Ethan felt something had changed. The next day, Sophie did not come to the cart, nor the day after. When he finally called, she answered with a quiet voice, "Ethan, you're a good man, but I think we want different things in life." That was all. Ethan stood in silence, holding his phone. His chest felt heavy. He didn't cry, but the light in his eyes dimmed. He went back to the cart the next morning and served coffee as usual, but his smile was smaller. For the next few weeks, he worked less, spoke less, and stopped adding new items to the menu. The number of customers slowly dropped. One afternoon, Rosa came home later than usual. She seemed quiet, and her eyes looked troubled. Ethan asked what had happened. She told him she had gone to a clothing shop in the rich part of town. When she entered, 2 women looked at her worn shoes and laughed. One said, "I don't think you'll find anything here." Rosa left without saying a word. Ethan felt something inside him burn. He said nothing, but his mind spoke clearly. "This will not happen again." That night, Ethan sat outside, looking at the stars. The air was cold, but he didn't feel it. He remembered Sophie's words, the laughter of the women in the shop, and the years of watching his mother work herself to exhaustion. In that moment, he made a new promise. He would not give up. He would work harder, smarter, and longer. Not only for himself, but for Rosa. And one day, no one would dare to laugh at her again. That was the moment I truly began to understand who Ethan Morales was. He wasn't just a young man selling coffee. He was someone who carried a dream so deeply in his heart that no loss, no insult, and no cold winter morning could take it away. But I didn't know then that his journey was only beginning. I could see the change in Ethan almost as soon as it began. He was standing straighter, speaking with more energy, and his eyes had the same light I saw the day he opened his cart. The small savings he had kept hidden for years were slowly growing again. Each morning, I passed by his spot at the bus station and saw more people stopping for coffee and pastries. His mother, Rosa, often stood nearby in the afternoons, chatting with customers and thanking them as if each sale was a personal gift. One rainy evening, I noticed Ethan sitting on the covered bench near the public library. A young woman was with him. She had short dark hair and a calm smile. She held a paper bag in her lap, and from it she fed crumbs to the pigeons gathered at her feet. I learned her name a few days later. Clara and Gwen worked as a librarian's assistant, caring for her, grandmother in a small apartment a few streets away. She started visiting Ethan's cart often, usually for tea instead of coffee. They talked about small things at first, weather, books, food, but I could tell she saw something in him beyond the cart. She asked him about his dreams, not his earnings. One afternoon, Rosa said to me while I was buying coffee, "Clara is good for him. She listens. She reminds him of who he is." I understood what she meant. Ethan had always been determined, but now he also seemed steadier. Months passed. The cart business grew until Ethan began to dream bigger. "I want a real place," he told Clara one night as they closed up the cart together. "A cafe with walls, tables, and music. Somewhere people can sit and stay a while." Clara smiled. "Then make it a place that feels like home." By spring, he found a small shop for rent on a quiet street corner. It had big windows, an old wooden counter, and enough room for 6 tables. It needed work, but Ethan didn't hesitate. He painted the walls warm yellow, added shelves for fresh bread, and hung a sign outside. Rosa's Kitchen Café. On opening day, the air was filled with the smell of baking bread and strong coffee. Rosa stood behind the counter beside her son, both wearing matching aprons. The first customers were neighbors, bus drivers, and office workers who knew Ethan from his cart. They were greeted with his usual smile and, for seniors, a free refill of coffee. At first, the cafe was a small success. People liked the cozy space and the way Rosa would sometimes come to their tables to ask how their day was. Clara helped with small things, arranging flowers in jars, choosing music for the background. I often stopped in after work, and it felt as though Brookhaven had gained not just a cafe, but a new meeting place. Then came the flood. It was a summer storm that lasted 2 days without stopping. The cafe's roof leaked in the storage area, and water damaged the fridge and one of the ovens. The repair costs were high. Ethan paid from his savings and took on extra shifts himself, determined not to let the cafe close. But without help, the long hours began to wear on him. He arrived before sunrise to bake and stayed until late at night to clean. I watched as his smile became thinner and his steps slower. He no longer came out to greet every customer, and sometimes the bread was not as fresh as before. Rosa noticed too, but she said nothing at first. Clara tried to talk to him one evening. I overheard her say, "Ethan, you need to rest. The cafe can't run if you run yourself into the ground." He shook his head. "If I stop now, everything we've built will fall apart." Her words didn't change his pace. Weeks later, a small accident shook things further. A customer found a piece of baking paper in her sandwich and mentioned it online. Comments spread through the local social media group. It wasn't cruel, but it made others wonder if Ethan's cafe was slipping. The next week, fewer people came in. Ethan tried to push harder, offering free cookies, lowering prices, but the tiredness in his eyes told a different story. One quiet afternoon, I walked past and saw him sitting alone at a table, head in his hands. The smell of coffee was still there, but the warmth in the air felt weaker. That evening, he closed the cafe early and locked the door. A sign appeared the next morning. Closed for repairs. Reopening soon. When I saw him later that day, he was walking through the park with Clara. They weren't talking much, just walking side by side. I heard him say softly, "I forgot why I started this." Clara looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Then remember, and start again." And so, part 2 of Ethan's story ended, not with celebration, but with quiet reflection. The cafe doors were shut, but something in his mind was opening again. He had not given up, only paused. And sometimes, I thought, a pause was the first step toward truly beginning again. When Ethan reopened the cafe, it felt different from before. He had painted the walls a softer color, added fresh flowers to every table, and changed the menu to include only what he could prepare with care. This time, he worked with a small team instead of trying to do everything alone. His friend Daniel helped in the kitchen, and a young student named Luis served customers with a bright smile. Clara still visited most evenings, and Rosa often came in the afternoons to sit by the window with her tea. The customers began to return. Some were old friends from the food cart days. Others were new faces drawn in by the warm light from the cafe windows. Ethan no longer rushed. He took time to greet people, ask about their families, and make each sandwich with attention. Slowly, Rosa's kitchen cafe became more than a place to eat. It became a meeting point for the community. People came not only for food, but for the feeling of belonging. One autumn afternoon, I sat in the corner watching Ethan serve a family with 2 small children. The little boy was laughing at something Rosa had said. I realized Ethan's smile now looked natural again. He was building not just a business, but a life that balanced work and peace. Months passed, and the cafe's steady success gave Ethan new courage. He spoke to Clara one evening after closing. "I think I'm ready to open a second shop, somewhere in the next town." Clara nodded. "Do it. But remember what you learned. Grow slowly. Keep it personal." He promised he would. Within a year, there was a second Rosa's Kitchen Cafe in the nearby town of Pinebrook. It was smaller than the first, but just as welcoming. Ethan trained the staff himself and made sure each shop felt like home. More customers meant more income, and soon he could improve his mother's house, fixing the roof, painting the walls, and adding a real kitchen for Rosa. By the time Ethan turned 30, he had 3 cafes and a small office. He worked hard, but he also took time for Rosa and Clara. Life was calmer, yet full of purpose. Then came the day that changed everything again. It was a bright spring morning, and guests were arriving for Ethan and Clara's wedding. The ceremony was simple, held in a garden surrounded by flowers. Rosa sat in the front row, dressed in soft pink, her eyes shining with pride. As I moved to take my seat, I saw a black car stop outside. A tall woman stepped out, wearing a red dress and high heels. She looked around, almost unsure. I recognized her from Ethan's past, Laura, the woman who had left him years ago. A staff member told Ethan she was there. He went to meet her in the garden. I kept my distance but saw their faces as they spoke. Laura looked regretful. "I didn't know what I was leaving behind," she said. "I thought you had no future, but I was wrong." Ethan listened quietly. She asked if they could talk again, maybe start over. Ethan shook his head. "No, Laura. That part of my life is over. I found someone who stood with me when I had nothing, and I'm marrying her today." Laura's eyes dropped, and she nodded. He walked away without looking back. The ceremony began soon after. Clara walked down the path in a simple white dress, carrying a small bunch of white flowers. Ethan's eyes stayed on her as if no one else existed. Their vows were honest and warm. Ethan promised never to forget what they had built together. Clara promised to protect the heart he had given her. When they finished, Rosa wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. That evening, the celebration took place not in a luxury hall, but in the cafe itself. The tables were moved aside, and neighbors filled the room with laughter and music. Ethan stood and gave a short speech. "I was once a man with torn shoes and a small cart. Today I have more than I ever dreamed, but I didn't walk here alone. My mother gave me strength. My wife gave me hope. And all of you gave me support. I will never forget this town." He then announced plans to open 3 new community projects: a free clinic, a school for children from low-income homes, and a business training center for young people. Over the next few years, Ethan's name spread beyond Brookhaven. He opened cafes in other towns and then in the city. By the time he was 35, Rosa's Kitchen had grown into a well-known brand across the state. But despite his success, Ethan never changed his habits. Every week he returned to Brookhaven, visited the park where he had once felt lost, and spent time at the original cafe. One evening, I found him sitting with Rosa on the porch of her improved house. She now had a team of caretakers and lived in comfort, but she was still the same warm woman who greeted everyone like family. Ethan told her about his plans to expand into other states. Rosa smiled. "Do it, but keep your heart where it belongs." He promised her he would. Ethan also kept his promise to the community. The clinic treated hundreds of patients for free. The school gave children a safe place to learn. The training center helped young people start their own small businesses. Many of them told me they saw Ethan not just as a businessman, but as proof that dreams could survive hard times. The last time I saw him in Brookhaven, it was late summer. He stood in the garden outside Rosa's house, looking at the sky as it turned gold. Clara joined him, holding a tray of tea. He took one cup and looked at her with the same steady warmth he had on their wedding day. "Everything we have," he said quietly, "started from nothing but hope." Clara smiled. "And it will keep growing, because you haven't forgotten." As the sun went down, I realized that Ethan's story was no longer just about a boy who had struggled to rise. It was about a man who had learned to rise with care, to build without losing himself, and to give back more than he had taken. And that, I thought, was the true measure of success.